Hello and welcome to my video all about how to do a slip stitch hem. The slip stitch is also referred to as the invisible stitch because it's barely visible on both the front and the back of the sewn fabric. This makes it great for all kinds of sewing uses, but is particularly useful for hemming clothing such as dresses and skirts. For this demonstration I'm going to be using some medium weight woven cotton fabric, and I'm going to be sewing down a double fold hem. For demonstration purposes I'm going to be using a fairly thick crochet thread in a contrasting colour, but of course you should use a regular sewing thread in a colour that matches your fabric, because after all you want these stitches to be as invisible as possible. The first thing you need to do is cut a piece of thread, tie a regular knot in one end, and feed the other end through a sewing needle. The double fold hem has already been pressed with an iron, and so that's ready to go. The way I like to hold the fabric whilst I'm sewing is to basically fold the hem back on itself so that the right sides of the fabric are together, as shown here. This effectively gives me 4 layers of fabric to hold, which makes me feel like I've got more control over my stitches. However, you can hold the fabric in a way that's most comfortable to you. To actually start stitching, we need to secure the thread to the fabric. To do this, I take the needle from inside the hem up through the fold at the top of the hem. To secure the thread further, I then do a short stitch at the top of the hem, right next to where I just came through the fabric. I pull the thread until there's just a small loop remaining. I take the needle through the loop and tighten. And because we've only stitched through the hem, none of this thread is visible on the front of the fabric. Okay, so now I've got the main body of the fabric, which is basically the front of my sewing project, nearest to me, and the hem furthest from me. The next part of the stitch involves going through the main body of the fabric, but because this part of the stitch is going to be seen on the front of your project, you want it to be as invisible as possible. To do this, you need to pick up as little fabric as you possibly can. So here I'm just showing you the least possible amount of fabric that I could pick up with my needle. This will make a pretty much invisible stitch. But you also have to take into account how strong the stitch is going to be, and obviously one strand is a lot more liable to break, so I wouldn't recommend it. For the next part of the stitch, we need to go into the folded edge of the hem. I now move along the hem to the left by as much as I did between the start of the stitching and where I picked up that strand of fabric. This is usually about 1/4 inch. The needle is basically inside the hem, and you need to move it parallel to the fold. And then you bring it up and out of the top of the fold again. The length of this stitch is normally between 1/4 inch and 1/2 inch. Remember that the closer the stitches are together, i.e. the shorter the stitches are, the stronger they will be. And then we repeat those steps again. So move a little along the hem. In my case I use about 1/4 inch distance, and then I pick up as little fabric as I can from the main body of fabric. Depending on the strength of the fabric, a few strands is ideal. And then move along the hem by the same distance again. Go into the fold of the hem. Feed it along under the fold for the same distance as you used before. And then come out of the fold again. Really, the important thing is to keep the stitches consistent. And then repeat again. So slightly to the left, pick up a few strands, go into the fold, and so on until you've finished your hem. Once you've finished, you'll want to secure the thread. The best way to do this is to attach it to the hem only, rather than the main body of fabric, because of course any stitches in the main body of fabric will be seen on the front of the project. So what I do is take my needle through the top of the hem, pull the thread until there's just a small loop remaining, take my needle through that loop and tighten. And then I repeat those steps. So I do a small stitch in the same position, pull the thread until there's just a loop, go through the loop and tighten. And that secures the thread. I then take my needle down through the hem and then out of the fabric on the hem side, before cutting off the excess thread. This hides the tail of thread inside the hem. And that's the slip stitch hem completed. As you can see, even on the back, the stitching is very subtle. If we look at the front now, we can see that only tiny amounts of thread are visible. In normal circumstances, I would have used a regular sewing thread in white, and if I had done, those stitches would be barely visible. And that's exactly why the slip stitch is known as the invisible stitch. Okay, so that's the tutorial finished. I really hope you found that useful, and thank you very much for watching.